He was a boy lost in a world he didn't quite understand, a world of whispers and shadows, where feelings hid behind masks and smiles didn't always reach the eyes. He navigated this labyrinth with a heart on his sleeve, a beacon of naivete in a cynical world. His innocence, a double-edged sword, both attracted and repelled. It made him an easy target, a lamb among wolves. He yearned for connection, for a hand to hold in the darkness. He dreamed of a love that would illuminate the shadows, a love that would make him feel truly alive. But his search for affection often led him down winding paths, each turn revealing another layer of the labyrinth he couldn't escape. His naivety painted a target on his back. People saw it as weakness, as an invitation to manipulate and control. They underestimated his quiet strength, his ability to love deeply and forgive easily. But beneath the surface, a storm brewed, a storm of confusion and hurt, of betrayal and self-doubt. He clung to the hope that one day he would find his way out of the labyrinth, that he would find someone who saw his innocence not as a weakness, but as a strength, someone who would cherish his heart and guide him through the darkness, someone who would love him, not despite his naivety, but because of it. Loneliness clung to him like a shroud. It followed him through crowded hallways and empty streets, a constant reminder of his isolation. It whispered in his ear, amplifying his insecurities and doubts. He longed to silence its relentless taunting, to fill the void with laughter and shared secrets. He craved the warmth of companionship, the comfort of a hand to hold. He yearned for someone to share his thoughts with, someone who would listen without judgment and understand without words, someone who would see past his awkward silences and appreciate his gentle soul. He watched other couples, their easy laughter and intertwined hands a painful reminder of his own solitude. He envied their effortless connection, their ability to navigate the complexities of love with grace and confidence. He longed to experience that same sense of belonging, to feel the weight of another's hand in his own. He knew he was different. He felt things more deeply, loved more fiercely. He wore his heart on his sleeve, a beacon of vulnerability in a world that often seemed determined to extinguish any trace of genuine emotion. But he refused to let the cynicism of the world harden his heart. He clung to the belief that somewhere out there, someone was searching for a love like his, a love built on trust and compassion, on acceptance and unwavering loyalty. Lost in thought, he fumbled with his car keys, his mind a million miles away. He barely noticed the girl at first, her presence a mere flicker in the periphery of his awareness. But she was impossible to ignore for long. With a boldness that bordered on audacity, she invaded his personal space, her youthful energy crackling in the air around them. He froze, startled by her sudden appearance and direct gaze. Her eyes, wide and bright, seemed to dance with mischief and a strange sort of innocence. He stammered, unsure how to respond to her unexpected intrusion. Who was this girl who approached strangers with such fearless abandon? Lost? She asked, her voice a playful sing-song. He could only nod, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment as he continued to fumble with his keys. He felt a strange mix of annoyance and intrigue. Her forwardness was unnerving, yet there was a certain charm to her unconventional approach. He was used to being overlooked, forgotten, yet here she was, this whirlwind of energy, focusing her attention solely on him. He couldn't deny a flicker of excitement at the unexpected encounter. Maybe this was a sign, a twist of fate in the mundane routine of his life. Maybe this girl, this unexpected interruption, was the connection he'd been yearning for. Found them! She exclaimed, holding his keys aloft like a prized possession. He stared at her, dumbfounded. Had she really just snatched his keys and then declared herself the hero of this little drama? He couldn't help but chuckle at her audacity. Without waiting for a response, she grabbed his hand, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through his arm. Come on, slowpoke, she chirped, pulling him along with surprising strength. He stumbled after her, his heart pounding in his chest. He was usually the one who followed, who blended into the background. But this girl, with her infectious energy and unwavering confidence, had a way of turning his world upside down. They arrived at a nearby bench where another girl sat, her expression a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Look what I found, his unexpected companion announced, pushing him forward like a prized possession. He blushed, acutely aware of his awkward stance and the skeptical gaze of the other girl. You're weird, the other girl stated, her tone flat. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the pavement beneath his feet. He hated being the center of attention, especially when that attention was laced with judgment. He looked at his captor, hoping she would take the hint and retreat, but she seemed unfazed by her friend's assessment, her smile unwavering. "He's not weird, he's just shy," she declared, her voice ringing with an odd protectiveness. He met her gaze, surprised by the unexpected defense. He had expected her to laugh along with her friend, to dismiss him as just another awkward encounter. But there was a strange sincerity in her eyes, a flicker of something akin to understanding. He found himself drawn to her quirky energy, her ability to find amusement in the mundane. She was like a breath of fresh air, disrupting the predictable rhythm of his life with her chaotic charm. He knew he should create some distance, should politely excuse himself and retreat to the familiar comfort of his solitude. But something held him back. "You're abandoning me?" she asked, her voice laced with mock hurt as he gathered his books, preparing to head to the library for an afternoon of studying. He hesitated, her words striking a chord within him. He knew she was joking, playing up the drama for her own amusement. But the word abandoning hung in the air, echoing his own deep-seated fear of being left behind. He sighed, a small smile playing on his lips. "Fine," he conceded. "You can come." Her face lit up, her smile genuine this time. He couldn't help but mirror her expression, his heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of a very unconventional friendship. He found himself captivated by her childlike enthusiasm. She fluttered around him like a butterfly, her touch light and fleeting, yet leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. She would tug on his sleeve, her laughter bubbling over at the slightest provocation. He was both amused and bewildered by her constant need for physical contact. He knew she craved affection, that her touchy-feely nature was her way of seeking validation and connection. He, on the other hand, was used to keeping his distance, to expressing himself through carefully chosen words rather than impulsive gestures. But he found himself drawn to her warmth, to the way her touch, though fleeting, chased away the shadows that clung to him. "You're so cute when you blush," she teased, her eyes sparkling with mischief. He would stammer, flustered by her teasing, yet secretly pleased by her attention. "I'm not being cute," he'd retort, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. But his protests were futile. She delighted in pushing his buttons, in eliciting a reaction from his usually stoic demeanor. He knew she found his awkwardness endearing, his innocence a refreshing change from the jaded cynicism of their peers. And despite his attempts to appear unaffected by her teasing, he couldn't deny the flutter of his heart every time she graced him with one of her mischievous smiles. One rainy evening, he found himself offering her a ride home. He had had a couple of drinks with friends, his usual inhibitions loosened by the alcohol. He knew he shouldn't be driving, but the thought of her braving the downpour alone tugged at his conscience. She hesitated, her brow furrowed in thought. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice unusually hesitant. He nodded, surprised by her uncharacteristic reluctance. He had grown accustomed to her impulsive nature, her eagerness to accept any adventure, no matter how spontaneous. The drive to her house was filled with an awkward silence, punctuated by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. He glanced at her from time to time, trying to decipher the reason behind her unusual quietness. He had expected her usual banter, her infectious laughter filling the confined space of the car. Instead, she sat with her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. When they arrived at her house, she surprised him further by inviting him inside. He hesitated, unsure if he should accept her invitation. He could already sense the disapproval radiating from his overprotective mother, her voice echoing in his ear, warning him against getting involved with a girl like her. But something about her vulnerability, her uncharacteristic hesitancy, compelled him to step inside. He found himself seated at their kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken tension. Her parents were absent, and the silence felt heavy, suffocating. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, wishing he had never agreed to come inside. She busied herself making coffee, her back to him as she moved around the small kitchen. "My parents are away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, startled by the vulnerability in her tone. It was a side of her he had never seen before. a glimpse beneath the carefully constructed facade of playful indifference. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the suffocating silence that had descended upon them, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by a sudden surge of emotion he couldn't quite place. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "I love you," he blurted out, the words tumbling from his lips before he could stop them. He instantly regretted his confession, his cheeks burning with shame. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. He cared for her deeply, was drawn to her vibrancy and her ability to make him feel alive. But love? Was it love or was it something else, something more akin to desperation, to a desperate need to hold on to someone, anyone who could chase away the loneliness that threatened to consume him? The confession hung in the air, a fragile bubble about to burst. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest, as he waited for her response. He had expected her to laugh, to dismiss his words as a drunken ramble, a product of the alcohol coursing through his veins. But her reaction surprised him. Her eyes widened, a flicker of something akin to panic flashing across her face. The silence stretched on, agonizing in its intensity. He wished he could take back his words, erase the vulnerability that painted his face like a scarlet letter. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of her silence crushing him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. What had he done? "You shouldn't say things you don't mean," she finally said, her voice devoid of its usual playfulness. He flinched at her words, their sharpness piercing through the fog of his intoxication. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain that he had meant it, that he did care for her, but the words wouldn't come. Her gaze held his, unwavering and strangely cold. It was as if a mask had slipped, revealing a darkness he hadn't noticed before, or perhaps had chosen to ignore. The playful, carefree girl he thought he knew seemed to vanish before his eyes, replaced by something colder, more calculating. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and hurt. Her playful teasing morphed into something sharper, her words laced with a subtle cruelty that left him reeling. She would withhold affection, her touch, once a constant source of comfort, now a weapon to be wielded against him. He tried to talk to her, to understand the sudden shift in her demeanor, but she would brush off his concerns with a roll of her eyes or a sarcastic remark. "You're being too sensitive," she'd say, her voice dripping with disdain. "I was just joking." He found himself walking on eggshells, terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing, of triggering another one of her icy stares. He hated himself for his weakness, for his inability to confront her, to demand the respect he deserved. But her mood swings left him disoriented, unsure of how to navigate the minefield of their relationship. He tried to cling to the memory of their early days, the shared laughter and stolen glances, but those memories seemed tainted now, overshadowed by the growing darkness that threatened to consume them both. He had stumbled into a labyrinth of her design, a tangled web of manipulation and mind games, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to find his way out. He felt a growing sense of panic rising within him, a suffocating feeling that he couldn't escape. The girl, once a source of comfort and excitement, now felt like a weight around his neck, dragging him down into the depths of her own unhappiness. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that he had become dependent on her unpredictable moods and fleeting moments of affection. His thoughts raced, a chaotic jumble of fear and longing. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. His grades began to slip, his concentration shattered by the constant anxiety that gnawed at his insides. He felt like a puppet, his strings being pulled by an unseen hand, his every move dictated by her whims. He knew he should walk away, that this relationship was toxic, destructive, but he couldn't bring himself to sever the tie, to face the gaping void that her absence would leave in his life. He clung to the hope that she would change, that the girl he thought he knew, the girl with the mischievous smile and the infectious laughter, would resurface from the darkness that had enveloped her. He found himself making excuses for her behavior, rationalizing her cruelty as a cry for help, a manifestation of her own inner demons. He convinced himself that he could save her, that his love, his unwavering devotion would be enough to pull her back from the brink. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered that he was deluding himself, that he was caught in a dangerous game he couldn't win. Back at school, after the Christmas break, a strange unease settled upon him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that unseen eyes followed his every move. The hallways, once bustling with familiar faces, now seemed filled with shadows, each one hiding a potential threat. He felt a shiver run down his spine as if a cold hand had brushed against his skin. One afternoon, as he hurried across the crowded courtyard, he collided with a girl he had never seen before. She was tall and slender, with long dark hair that cascaded down her back like a silken waterfall. But it was her eyes that startled him, their depths holding a chilling intensity that sent a wave of unease washing over him. "Excuse me," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. He tried to step around her, but she moved with him, blocking his path. He felt a strange pressure emanating from her, a palpable aura of menace that made it difficult to breathe. "I know you," she said, her voice soft yet strangely penetrating. He frowned, searching his memory for any trace of recognition. He had never seen this girl before in his life, yet her words, spoken with such unwavering certainty, sent a shiver down his spine. He tried to dismiss her words as the ramblings of a stranger, but something about her gaze, her unsettling aura, filled him with a growing sense of dread. He felt a strange compulsion to confide in her, to pour out the fear and confusion that had been swirling within him for weeks. "You're being controlled," she whispered, her eyes boring into his with an almost hypnotic intensity. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. It was as if she had plucked the truth from his mind, had given voice to the fear that had been gnawing at his insides. "She's not who you think she is," she continued, her voice a low, hypnotic murmur. "She's using you, playing games with your mind." Her words struck a chord within him, echoing the doubts that had been plaguing him for weeks. He had tried to ignore them, to dismiss them as a product of his own insecurities, but now, faced with the unsettling certainty in her gaze, he could no longer deny the truth. He wanted to run, to escape the suffocating intensity of her presence, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. He was trapped, caught in the web of her words, his mind spinning as he struggled to make sense of her cryptic pronouncements. Section 3. Crash and Confession. The days that followed were a blur of mounting anxiety and reckless abandon. He couldn't shake the image of the strange girl's face from his mind, her words echoing in his ears like a haunting melody. He felt himself unraveling, the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart crumbling under the weight of fear and self-doubt. His work suffered, his concentration shot. He would spend hours staring blankly at his computer screen, his mind a million miles away. He couldn't focus, couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that his life was spiraling out of control. One evening as he drove home after a particularly grueling shift, his exhaustion finally caught up with him. He wasn't even sure how it happened. One minute he was driving, the next he was staring through a cracked windshield at a snowdrift. He had veered off the road, his car skidding on a patch of black ice. He had been lucky, he realized, his heart pounding in his chest. He could have been seriously injured, even killed. He stumbled out of the wrecked car, his legs shaky beneath him. He needed to call someone, to tell his family what had happened. But as he reached for his phone, he realized, with a sinking feeling, that he couldn't face their disappointment, their "I told you so" expressions. He needed someone who wouldn't judge him, someone who would simply listen. And in that moment, the only person he could think of was her. Section 1. A Glimmer of Hope. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he shouldn't contact her, that his family had forbidden it, that it was for his own good, but the need to hear her voice, to feel some semblance of connection, outweighed his better judgment. He typed out a message, his words a jumbled mix of apology and longing. He told her about the accident, about the overwhelming fear that had gripped him in its aftermath. He told her he still cared, still felt drawn to her despite the pain she had caused him. He waited for her response, his anxiety mounting with each passing minute. He knew he was playing with fire, that this could be the final straw, the catalyst that would sever their connection for good. But a part of him, a small, desperate part, clung to the hope that she would surprise him, that she would see his vulnerability, his genuine need for her, and respond with a flicker of the warmth he had once glimpsed in her eyes. Her reply, when it finally came, was not what he had expected. There was no anger, no accusation in her words. Instead, she met his vulnerability with a strange, unsettling detachment, as if his pain was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Obviously, I'm sad. What did you think? She wrote back, her words laced with a sardonic humor that made his stomach twist. He should have known better, he chided himself. He had bared his soul, exposed his deepest fears, and she had responded with the emotional depth of a calculator. He should have felt angry, betrayed, but all he could feel was a profound sadness, a weary acceptance of the fact that she was incapable of offering the empathy, the genuine connection that he craved. He told her she needed help, that her behavior wasn't normal, that she was only hurting herself. He knew his words were futile, that she wasn't ready to hear them, but he couldn't help but try. He had to believe that beneath the layers of manipulation and indifference, a flicker of humanity still remained. Her response was swift and predictable. She accused him of lying, of twisting the narrative to make himself the victim. She brought up past arguments, long-forgotten slights, using them as ammunition to deflect his concerns. He listened to her words, his heart growing heavier with each passing moment. He had hoped that this time would be different, that she would finally drop the facade and reveal the scared, hurting girl he believed was hiding beneath her carefully constructed armor. But he was starting to realize that the girl he thought he knew, the girl he had poured his heart and soul into saving, might not exist at all. He ended the conversation, his fingers trembling as he blocked her number. He couldn't do this anymore, couldn't subject himself to her emotional roller coaster any longer. He needed to protect himself, to reclaim his life from the clutches of her toxic influence. But just as he thought he had finally broken free, she surprised him once again. She reappeared in his life as if nothing had happened, her face devoid of any trace of the coldness that had characterized their last encounter. "I was mad," she said simply, her voice soft and apologetic. He stared at her, his mind reeling. Was she serious? Did she truly believe that those two words could erase weeks of manipulation and emotional abuse? He refused to give her the satisfaction of a hug, of the physical comfort she craved. He stood his ground, his gaze steady as he met her eyes. Her mask slipped for a moment, her carefully constructed facade crumbling as panic flickered in her eyes. "You're ignoring me!" she asked, her voice rising in disbelief. It was the most genuine emotion she had displayed in weeks, and in that moment, he knew he had won. He had seen through her games, exposed her manipulations for what they were. He had faced his demons, had conquered the fear that had kept him bound to her for so long. He spoke calmly, his voice firm as he listed her transgressions, her cruel words, her calculated attempts to undermine his confidence and isolate him from his support system. She had no defense against his words, against the quiet power of his newfound self-respect. He stammered, repeating the same tired excuses, her voice a broken record of denial and deflection. He watched her, a strange mix of pity and triumph washing over him. He had once believed that he needed her, that his happiness depended on her fickle affections. But now, as he witnessed her pathetic attempts to regain control, he realized the truth. He was strong enough to stand on his own, to build a life filled with genuine connection and unwavering self-worth. As he turned to leave, he heard her voice, small and uncertain, calling after him. He paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, he was tempted to look back, to offer her a few words of comfort, of false hope. But he knew that any attempt at reconciliation would only lead him back down the same path of destruction. He had escaped her labyrinth, and he had no intention of ever returning. The boy stood at the precipice of a newfound understanding, the weight of his experience etched onto his young features. The encounter with the girl, with the embodiment of manipulation disguised as affection, had cost him dearly. His innocence, once a shining beacon, now felt like a badge of naivete, a reminder of the harsh lessons he had been forced to learn. He had entered the labyrinth of love with a heart full of hope, yearning for a connection that would chase away the shadows of loneliness. But the path he had chosen led him not to the light, but to a deeper, more profound darkness. He had been ensnared in a web of deceit, his kindness mistaken for weakness, his empathy exploited for another's gain. The pain of betrayal was still fresh, a dull ache in his chest. He had opened his heart, had offered his vulnerability on a silver platter, only to have it tossed back in his face. He had believed in the best of her, had clung to the hope that her love, once genuine, could be rekindled. But the girl he had poured his heart and soul into saving had vanished, replaced by a hollow shell of her former self. Yet, amidst the wreckage of his shattered illusions, a flicker of gratitude ignited within him. He had emerged from the labyrinth, battered but not broken. He had stared into the abyss of manipulation and emerged stronger, his spirit tempered by the fires of his ordeal. The boy, forever marked by the labyrinth's twists and turns, carried the scars of his journey with a quiet strength. He had learned that love in its purest form could not exist without respect, without a shared commitment to honesty and emotional vulnerability. He had learned that forgiveness, while noble, should never come at the expense of his own well-being. The experience had peeled back layers of naivete, exposing a resilience he never knew he possessed. He had faced his fears, had confronted the darkness that resided within both himself and the girl he had loved. And in doing so, he had discovered a strength that transcended the pain of heartbreak, a strength that would guide him towards a future filled with authentic connections and unwavering self-love. The labyrinth had been his crucible, testing his limits, forcing him to confront the depths of his own resilience. And though he emerged wounded, he also emerged transformed. He had learned the hard way that not all who wander are lost, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is knowing when to walk away. The path ahead was uncertain, but he faced it with a newfound clarity and a heart open to the possibility of genuine connection. He had learned to trust his instincts, to recognize the red flags of manipulation, and to value his own emotional well-being above all else. The labyrinth had been a brutal teacher, but it had imparted a wisdom that would stay with him long after the pain of heartbreak had faded. He was no longer the naive boy who had stumbled into love's labyrinth, but a survivor, forever changed by the darkness he had faced and the light he had found within himself.